In a world gone mad, only rationality and common sense can save it. It's Andrew and Jerry Save the World with your hosts, Andrew Langer and Jerry Rogers. And now, here's Andrew and Jerry.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Andrew and Jerry Save the World, episode 6. Andrew and Jerry Save Free Speech. I am Andrew Langer, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Jerry.
Hello, Andrew.
Hi.
Jerry Rogers here.
Jerry Rogers, who
I'm not sure how successful we've been at saving the world. The world still seems to be going in the wrong direction.
Well, Jerry, but we're saving individual issues at a time, right? And so, listen, I'll tell you something. You say that, though, right? But we had a conversation last week with Tony Schaefer about Ukraine. And what happens? The Biden administration changes its policy towards Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of debate and discussion over what they're doing, but certainly you can say that listen, I'm not saying that causation or correlation equals causation, but all I do know is we had a conversation last week and then
this is true. Tony Schaefer, to remind our listeners, Tony Schaefer said he predicted that Russia will somehow, in some manner, invade Ukraine within 2 weeks.
Yes.
And then shortly thereafter, the next day, President Joe Biden invited Russia to invade.
Yeah, it was
Ukraine.
a couple days, right? It was a couple days later, and let and I should pull up the audio, but I'm not going to do that right now. The president talked about it. The president gave that winding long press conference, and was asked about responses to Russia in Ukraine, and he said, "Well, it depends. It depends on if it's a minor incursion or something else." Which is a whole new doctrine, and actually, Jerry,
and then even when the president tried to fix it himself, right? His aides went out, Jen Psaki and others went out trying to correct what he said, but then he a couple of days thereafter talked about how if military units cross the border, and the former Secretary of State under the Trump administration. What's his name again?
Blinken.
No, not Blinken.
No, Blinken's the current guy. Pompeo.
Yeah. Pompeo gave an interview and he said, again, what the president says, if he's not precise, can be an invitation to do the wrong thing, because there are myriad ways in the 21st century to invade a country.
Absolutely.
It could be small units or small reconnaissance. It also could be software and technology attacks, etc.
It could be cyber.
Yes.
It could be financial.
Right.
It could be unmanned. UAVs and overflies that way, or it could be actual man. But this gets into something else, Jerry, which is funny. So the timeline: Biden says this on Thursday afternoon and Friday and into the weekend, there is all of this scrambling on the part of the White House. Then on Sunday, over the weekend, Biden then announces that they're going to deploy, at first it was 5,000, now it's up to 8,500 troops to various NATO bases surrounding Ukraine. So no troops going into Ukraine. And this gets into something now, right, there's a lot of discussion. And we as conservatives, or we on the right, need to be really careful, because we can't, on the one hand, criticize Biden for having I'm going to use the phrase flaccid. Flaccid's probably not the right word, but let's say a tepid response or a mixed response to then having a cogent response. We can't criticize that cogent response. But on the other hand, Jerry, you were talking about the tendency towards overcorrection.
Well, and again, we've seen this, right? Throughout history, Democrats have invited aggression.
Yeah.
And what happens as a result is they're forced to, or America is forced to then to over respond. And this is a real problem. Listen, a lot of our friends on the right, and I see it on social media, and by the way, social media is going to be the topic the topic today. But
among the topic,
many of our friends on the right are saying that, hey, secure our southern border before we secure Ukraine border. No American should die for Ukraine. Ukraine is not in the interest of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what our friends on the right misunderstand two things. First is that don't judge the overcorrection in terms of judging the entire policy. What's happening in Ukraine does impact the United States, number one. And then number two, again, we fault the left for forgetting history. The fact of the matter is we cannot appease Putin. We just can't do it. And if we allow him to take part of Ukraine, he already took, during the Obama years, he already took Crimea, correct?
Yes, he did. And portions of eastern Ukraine.
Right. We cannot let him to continue. Again, interesting. We're not here to defend the former president, but the fact of the matter is we did not see this type of aggression from Russia, from China during the Trump years.
Yes.
Anyway.
Listen, these are the point in the end is we have to be consistent as a movement, I suppose, is one of the ways to put it.
Right.
And so we have to recognize that there is a threat, and that threat has to be dealt with in a very strong fashion. Whether or not the U.S. has direct interest in Ukraine, well, no, but the U.S. has interest in checking Russian aggression. That's certainly an issue here. And the issue, of course, of you don't want to deploy troops or put troops in a position where they, unless you are willing to commit them and put them in harm's way. And that's certainly an issue here. And, as we talked about with Tony Schaefer last week, there is a legitimate question about our obligations under treaty to Ukraine.
Sure.
And so people understand, because I really do want to get into our discussion of speech. Let me make it really clear. When the Soviet Union fell, a huge amount of the former Soviet Union's nuclear weapons were on bases in Ukraine because Ukraine had been a Soviet territory. So when Ukraine became an independent state, it inherited all of these nuclear weapons within its sovereign borders. And as there was a huge push on the international community at the time, this is in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, there was a huge push to make sure that somebody got control, that these nuclear arms were not dispersed to nations around.
Get in the hands of oligarchs.
Well, yeah, but what could happen is that they could get into the hands of terrorists.
In retrospect, they should have stayed right where they were.
Well, possibly. I mean, but again, hindsight's 2020 and all of these things. And I don't think who knows what would have happened to a Ukraine that had nuclear arms? Who knows?
Well, I tell you one thing that would not have happened.
Yeah,
you wouldn't see Russian troops on its border.
Russian troops invading. Sure. Yeah. But the point is this: that the international community convinced Ukraine to give these weapons up to Russia,
and now that same international community is allowing the Russians to take Ukraine piece by piece.
The point is that there was a pledge that was made, and there's a lot of discussion about the language of this. I wrote about this in 2014 about our obligations. My mentor and professor, my advisor in my Sovietology classes, Dr. Ann Henderson, she and I had lots of conversations about this, about the issues about whether or not we really do have a treaty obligation. The point is, it should be open for discussion. Anyway, that's where we are.
Yeah.
At the very least, there needs to be a greater discussion of what our obligations are under international law. And if we're going to break the treaty, then we need to say we're breaking the treaty. And it's just that simple. But Jerry, it's not what we're going to talk about today.
I know. But let me say two things. The first thing is that international law is useless. International law is useless because it's only effective insofar as nations adhere to it.
Of course,
yes. And when there's a Putin, when there is a Biden, they can interpret international law in a manner that helps their policies.
Right. And this gets into something that we've been talking about over the last few weeks and something we're going to continue to talk about. By that definition, then a lot of American law is useless because it's open to
well, we'll get into that because we'll talk about
interpretation by whoever's
the bottom line. Here's the bottom line of this segment, and that is as we go into the next the topic of the show, and that is one thing you and I would never do. Even if we disagreed on the value of international law, even if we disagreed over Joe Biden's policies or whether or not sending troops there is good policy, bad policy, whether or not Americans should shed blood for Ukraine, the one thing we wouldn't do is stifle that conversation.
Absolutely true.
We wouldn't tell people, well, they should be banned from this platform because they are promoting a dangerous false narrative.
Yes,
many times so-called censors. Censorship is unpredictable. It's arbitrary. It's often capricious. Absolutely. And we see that on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. We've been victims of it on YouTube just recently.
Yeah. So the point is, on today's show, we're going to be joined by Professor Eugene Volokh, who is teaches about free speech. He runs a free speech amicus clinic at UCLA Law School. He's going to join us in about 15 minutes to talk about these issues and to talk about social media and the thorny issue of social media platforms and speech and censorship. And Jerry, with that in mind, let's open up our Ripped from the Headlines segment.
Ripped from the Headlines.
So, as we've said, and it's interesting because it's not just because of what happened to us a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who are unfamiliar, our episode 4, Andrew and Jerry Save the Supreme Court, which is out there on all of the major podcast platforms in audio format, and the video of it is available at Rumble. Jerry, I want to say this. I'm sorry. Please subscribe, like, recommend, and review wherever you're listening to or watching the podcast. Please do that because it certainly helps us get noticed. I had to throw that in there, Jerry. The point is that video about within 12 hours of when I uploaded that video to YouTube, I got an email from YouTube saying that they were taking it down because it violated their standards because of our discussion of COVID-19 and the science around COVID-19. And for those of you who are not aware, my co-host here, Jerry Rogers, is the editor of Real Clear Health.
Indeed.
So Jerry is constantly reading about healthcare policy and policies centered around COVID-19 literally all the time.
Yes,
he has an encyclopedic knowledge of these things. but the issue is it's obviously that we have an interest in that because of what happened to us. Obviously, we've discussed that before. I am convinced that I am shadow banned on Twitter, for instance, which means I'm not actually banned, but I have several thousand people that follow me on Twitter. Thousands of people follow me on Twitter. But any tweet that I have that's political, that smacks of anything political, gets very few impressions on Twitter. Very few people see it. If I talk about something that's not political at all, I will get thousands upon thousands of tweets. Now, maybe it's because people aren't interested in politics, and they're much more interested in Scott Baio or the cars. But nevertheless, so there's that, and actually, before we get into it, Jerry, because you called me this morning to talk about some of these things, you were very much on fire, and you were tying a lot of things together here.
Well, again, because the 30,000-foot level idea here is Arthur Brooks, former head of Arthur Brooks, the former head of the American Enterprise Institute. He's now a scholar there. Did a lot of work on communication and on how to be persuadable, how to win an argument. And one of the ways to discuss, exchange ideas with the left is to use their value system in the conversation, to use their tactics, to use what's familiar to them. Fairness, right? social justice. These issues matter. So when talking about, say, abortion, you don't talk about it from the perspective of the average pro-lifer or right-winger. In fact, you talk about human rights, and you talk about women's rights, and you talk about the value of science and this sort of thing. And so part of me believes that when dealing with social media censorship, why not do what the left does? And what I mean by that is this: the left will say private school A in New Jersey cannot advance this part of its mission because this part of its mission violates our understanding of social justice. Yeah. And so therefore, if you're going to take federal monies for textbooks, federal monies to get your school prepared for COVID-19. In other words, if any kind of federal touch is on your private institution, well, then you must adhere to these federal guidelines, these federal priorities. Well, why don't we do that? When it comes to social media, when it comes to Facebook in particular, Facebook and the rest of these social platforms receive all kinds of breaks and protections. In fact, you can't watch Roku without seeing 10,000, I exaggerate, 10,000 commercials, Facebook wanting more federal regulation. And so if the federal government, if the feds touch Facebook so much, then why isn't Facebook why don't they come under the Bill of Rights and the free speech protections?
But I think you're conflating two different things, and we'll get into this with Gene Volokh here, right? Because remember, Facebook is calling for increased regulations because they know the writing is on the wall. They know that something is going to happen with regards to content restriction. And what they want to do is they want to be able to write the regulations. Essentially, that's what they want. They want to make the most onerous regulations that they know that they can comply with, but that they will know that they can keep their competitors away from.
I understand that, but my point, and I don't mean to conflate, I just meant to say this as Facebook itself admits that it has a relationship, a partnership with the government. Fred Smith from CEI, our old boss, would talk about this all the time. He would say that it is dangerous, for instance, when pharmaceutical companies through Medicaid and Medicare partner with the government, and then the government comes in with price controls and formulary lists and other kinds of restrictions, then it is what it is. You've decided to partner. Well, Facebook and YouTube and all the rest have partnered with the government. So therefore, why doesn't the Constitution, which restricts government, why doesn't it also then protect free speech and religious liberty online?
Well, because I don't think it's the same kind of a partnership in the way that you're talking about. I don't see Facebook calling for increased federal regulation to be them asking for a partnership, except insofar as they want to write the rules in the same way that pharmaceutical companies that are doing business with the government under Medicare or Medicaid are partnering.
Except, I hear your point.
Yeah,
and again, this is we'll have the expert on.
Jerry, time out for a second. Let me.
But 230 regulation
time out for a
is
second.
A partnership.
No, I don't think the Section 230 issue is a partnership insofar as it's a way of writing the law. So there are laws.
It's an umbrella protection,
but that's not a partnership. Time out. No, hold on. Because I think you're using the term partnership. I don't think that's the right term here. I think that there has been a carve out given in the law to these businesses.
I understand. Carve out is again. It's a. I'm going to use Dr. Langer's admonition, and that is the people listening to us have a sense of what partnership means.
Yeah, but
you're being nuanced.
Right, Jerry, but you talk about partnership.
Making a deal is a partnership.
Hold on, partnership is when GM gets a bailout from the federal government. And the federal government inserts itself into what GM is doing.
Who do you think wrote the 230 regulation?
Well,
lobbyists from Facebook.
I'm sure, but that's not to say that Facebook. All right, okay. If Facebook, right? Remember, we went through this discussion. We didn't do it on the air on these airwaves, but remember when the Biden administration was talking about trying to get COVID skeptics taken off of Twitter, right? So, and there was, I think there was a member of Congress who was banned, or at least suspended. You know, if the Biden administration, if the federal government is telling the social media people who to kick off, that's a partnership, right? In the same way that if the federal government is saying we're going to buy X numbers, you know, something, I'm not going to.
But here, Andrew, just this past week, in the past week alone.
Yeah.
And again, you know, sometimes the federal government tells you to do something. Sometimes it gives you a wink and a nod. The president of the United States was on this week, and he pleaded with social media platforms and the media to censor so-called misinformation. And then you had on this week the Surgeon General of the United States calling on social media companies to censor information.
Okay, right. And if the federal government is actively talking behind the scenes to get them to do this, that's a partnership. That
I'm saying that
listen, it is disturbing, right? It is disturbing for the federal government, for people in the executive branch to actively make that call. Because remember, fascism is the intersection of corporate and state power. I put my fingers together. Yeah. Jerry, I just want to show you something before we bring on our guest, because we're going to bring on our guest in just a second here.
All right.
I want to when I talk about shadow banning, this is what I'm talking about here. So I tweeted out just the other day this tweet about Hollins College, and which is a girls' school, Hollins University, and who is considered a woman for the purposes of matriculation here. And then I had a clip of Tucker Carlson. That I put that out on January 22nd. That got 205 impressions. And I want you to contrast this, and this is a couple of years back. I had Scott Baio on WBAL. I tweeted out about it, and most of these impressions came within the first 12 hours. I got 21,000 impressions, almost 22,000 impressions there. You know, and I can talk about other things and show other examples of this. And again, I know that anecdotes, the plural of anecdotes, is not data, but nevertheless, it was an issue. Here's the thing, and I want to set this up in this way before we bring on our guest, because we're going to switch Zooms in a second here.
Well, the audience doesn't know that.
That's all right. That's a period behind the scenes. As you can tell, Jerry and I are of different minds about this, and we are trying to noodle through, especially given the stances that we took on net neutrality, for instance, which was an issue of how internet service providers were going to get regulated in terms of how they could price out access to data and data transmission. That was what net neutrality was all about. And I took what I consider still the right position, which is the federal government should not be setting rates for these internet service providers. And these internet service providers should be able to price different usages differently, right? So if I pony up $100,000 a month, not that I'm ponying up $100,000 a month, I should be able to get premium access to my internet service providers. But someone who is paying $5 a month or paying nothing for their access to the internet, they will have a slower service. This is different than what we're talking about here. But by the same token, if I'm calling for no regulation on the one side, wrapping my head around how we get regulation on the other side, that's a thorny issue. And this is why we're having Eugene Volokh on. So tell you what, Jerry, let's go to our expert advice segment, and let's bring on our guest, Professor Eugene Volokh.
Expert advice.
We are back. I am Andrew Langer. This is our expert advice segment of Andrew and Jerry Save the World. I'm putting my glasses on because our guest has joined us. His name is Eugene Volokh. He is the Gary T. Schwartz Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA. He teaches First Amendment law. He runs a First Amendment amicus brief clinic. He's also, listen, he clerked for one of my favorite Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor, also clerked for Alex Kaczynski on the Ninth Circuit. And as it happens, I've known his brother. Oh, I'm sorry. Also founder, and we'll pull it up in a second, founder along with his brother of the Volokh Conspiracy, which was its own thing. It's a blog about law and liberty. Was the Washington Post for a long time. Now it's back at Reason, at reason.com. As I said, we'll put up the link. And as I was about to say, I've known his brother for a very long time. In fact, Professor Volokh, I was going to pull this up. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Your brother ran a series of online Zoom-based Shakespeare play readings. Here I am with your brother Sasha doing reading, I want to say Henry VI, back about a year ago. So welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be on.
So let's start here. And when we've started doing this, because we really do, we tend to overcomplicate things, but we want to start simply. Tell us, as though we're, let's not say 5 years old, but as though we're high school students, explain to us the thorny nature of the discussion, the debate over how to regulate, or even if to regulate, how social media platforms censor or review content.
Sure. So the First Amendment protects against government action, protects against having you be thrown in jail, or having you be sometimes kicked off of government property, or maybe fired from your government job and the like. What about private action? What if an employer fires you because of your speech, or because you support some political candidate or some such? That's a matter that's left to state and federal and sometimes local law. So for example, about half the states have rules that in some form or another protect private employees from being fired by their employers for the employee's political activity, or often just even quite broadly speech. It's not that the First Amendment protects these private employees, because the First Amendment applies, the first word is Congress. Congress will make no law. It applies to states and local governments through the 14th Amendment, which says no state may do certain things. So the First Amendment by itself doesn't protect these employees, but in fact it inspires in some measure these statutes, not in all states, but in some states, that protect employees against such retaliation. Likewise, when it comes to free exercise of religion, if your employer fires you because he doesn't like your religion, that's not a violation of the Free Exercise Clause, but it is a violation, if the employer is large enough, of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and of many state statutes as well. So one question that arises is, should similar restraints be imposed on private platforms, and such as, say, social media platforms? And one way of thinking about it is to think about the spectrum of platforms. So one possible platform is a newspaper. It's a platform for letters to the editor, platform for op-eds, platform for ads. And by the way, here I'm talking about outsiders submitting stuff. Obviously, much of what the newspaper publishes is published by its own employees, but it also provides a place where the public could speak, but nobody has a right to speak there. And if the government says you have a First Amendment right to have your op-ed published in a newspaper, that would violate the newspaper's own First Amendment rights. There's a case called Miami Herald v. Tornillo. A bookstore, probably like that too. There are no Supreme Court cases on the right of bookstores to choose which books to carry, or more importantly for us not to carry. But it's probably a pretty fair inference that, especially if you're a kind of an old bricks and mortar bookstore and you specialize in free market books or feminist books or socialist books or Christian books, you're entitled to pick and choose. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum. What about the phone company? What if the phone company says,
yes,
we are really, really upset that somebody has this phone line where they're a recruiter for the KKK or for Antifa or for some other group we disapprove of. And it's not like we're listening in on those conversations. There's no invasion of privacy here. We know that they have this phone service using our phone lines because there are ads out there saying, call this number in order to hear about the KKK and why you should join us. Well, the phone company can't eject or can't cancel that service because that is the phone company is treated as a common carrier by federal law.
Professor Oler, let me just interrupt for a second, just let you know, I pulled up on the screen for folks to see, you have this piece out, which is a really great law review article, treating social media platforms like common carriers. I'll put the link up on our show page so folks can read themselves, but I'm sorry, sir. Go right ahead, please keep going.
There. The title is treating social media platforms like common carriers. There's a
question mark at the end. Let me very good point.
This is a complicated question. And I'm
absolutely
specific to that as to certain features of social media platforms, but it's far from clear that it's the right answer. But in any case, so on one end are entities that we expect to pick and choose what to carry. They have a First Amendment right to pick and choose what to carry. Even more clearly than newspapers, for example, magazines, which are often, and many newspapers at least claim to be objective, but many magazines do not.
Yes.
Your Republic you expect it to provide things from one perspective. National Review, you expect it to do that. And in fact, there's real value in their picking and choosing, because it adds to the set of options that we have, that we can say, well, if we want to subscribe to a center-left magazine or center-right or hard left or deliberately moderate, we can do that. Likewise, they solve the problem of information overload. There are all these possible articles out there and everything that's happening every day. The reason we subscribe to a newspaper is because we want it to exercise its editorial judgment. What it excludes is as important to us as what it includes. On the other hand, that's not the way we've conceptualized phone companies. Phone companies are private entities, but they don't have a First Amendment right, at least the court has never said, have never even suggested they have a First Amendment right, to say we refuse to allow our services to be used by views that we think are evil and false. And on top of that, that's true not just for landlines, which are regulated monopolies. It's also true for the famously competitive cell phone providers. So it's not just a matter of, oh, monopolies are regulable this way. Likewise, UPS and FedEx are also common carriers as transportation entities. So for example, if UPS says, we will not deliver any books sent by this bookstore because we think this bookstore traffics in misinformation and advocacy of genocide and of racism and of that's unpatriotic and anti-war, whatever UPS might think about that, they have to carry that stuff on the same terms as they carry any books. So the question is where we fit social media platforms. Although maybe a question is, where do we fit various functions of various social media platforms? So for example, one thing that social media platform does is it provides recommendations. You might like this because it's trending, or you might like this based on our algorithm that you've liked these other things, you might like this as well. Classic example of that, not for social media platforms, is Google. Google search results. And I should tell you, by the way, I wrote a paper on this as a lawyer for Google. So it was not an article, but I do think that it is quite right that Google ought to have pretty broad First Amendment rights to decide what to present. And among other things, we don't want Google to be content and viewpoint neutral. That would totally eliminate its value as a search engine.
Can I interject and ask you a question? Because now, this gets into, it's really interesting, because one of the things that I've talked about with regards to, for instance, Facebook, and I've never talked about it with Google, but I would think Google would be part and parcel of this. So let's say that you are a just political organization X, or political nonprofit organization X. I'm going to make that really clear. And you decide you want to start promoting your content on Facebook or Google or what have you, and you pay Google or Facebook to promote, to make recommendations, right? To get yourself in the feed somewhere. But Google, obviously Google has, as you said, a right, and of course now my phone has picked up on what I just said and is answering me. Google has the right to pick and choose what and how it recommends. But if I'm paying money to Google or Facebook, obviously they can tell me that they're not going to accept my money to promote that material. But if they do they have an obligation to turn around and then tell me, well, we are not recommending this material based upon our First Amendment rights to pick and choose, right? Because it gets into this whole thing. A lot of folks talk about the terms of service and how things get, a little opaque. We did a video on YouTube that got banned because YouTube didn't like how we were talking about the current events regarding masks and science. Do they have an obligation to tell us with specificity what content they're promoting and what they're not promoting?
So if I understand you correctly, I think you're asking an important question, but one that's different from the common carrier question.
Sure, yes.
Which is sort of as a matter of consumer protection.
Yes.
Do they have an obligation to distinguish paid advertisements from things that they chose based on an algorithm that is supposedly aimed at maybe serving you or even serving their own ideology, but that isn't paid for?
Well, and right, more to the point, hold on, more to the point, do they have an obligation to tell you that, as you are talking about things on their social media platform, these are not things we are going to recommend? Like I just posted a thing from Twitter where I was talking about Hollins College and discriminatory practices at Hollins University. That tweet got 200 views, impressions on Twitter. I posted something about Scott Baio and I got 20,000 views. It's very clear that there's a disparate. So does Twitter have an obligation to tell me?
What you're describing is that people are much more interested in celebrity gossip than they are.
Well,
we don't need a disclaimer saying that.
Yes, but my point is, I've noticed over the last couple of years that if I say something that is completely innocuous, that will get much more views. If I say something that might be slightly controversial, it gets fewer views. No, yeah, you're right. I know this. As I just said, the plural of anecdotes is not data. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Right. Well, so I think this is a great question. It is not the one that I had thought you were asking, and it is one that's a little closer to the common carrier question. To what extent can you require platforms to disclose the basis for their judgments about what to promote, what not to promote, what to rank higher, what to rank lower? It's an interesting issue, has its own kind of conceptual complexities. Yeah. Certainly, that's not something we generally expect of newspapers, right? If you write a letter to the editor and they don't publish it, you're not entitled to a statement saying, here's why we didn't publish it. They can just say, we thought it was kind of dumb.
Andrew, let me cut to the chase. Is Twitter, are these common carriers?
So I think the answer is no, because common carrier is a term for a legal status that historically had been decided by courts at times. Like they would say, oh, this entity should be a common carrier, sort of as a matter of common law. These days, it generally has to be defined by statute. So the question is
okay, I understand. Right now. So let me follow up then. And again, I'm a novice, but a railroad is a common carrier, correct?
By statute.
All right,
so
by statute.
I think you might be asking is
should we have a 21st century reevaluation of what a common carrier is?
Right. Well, I do think we should be reevaluating the sense of thinking about it. What the ultimate conclusion I think is hard, but I think the answer is the question is, should they be treated as common carriers? And relatedly, may they be treated as common carriers? Because again, if we try to treat a newspaper as a common carrier, that probably violates its First Amendment rights.
Sure.
Treating a phone company as a common carrier doesn't. The question is, what about social media platforms? So the first thing I want to say is I think that we need to distinguish different functions of the platform. So one is the recommendation function. That's where they really are speaking themselves in the sense that they are affirmatively recommending something. So like a phone company, to the extent it does speak itself, let's say in a phone book, it may have its own editorial content. You can't say, well, you have to promote this particular nonprofit alongside others. They could say, well, we want to recommend community organizations that we really like and not everybody, not ones we dislike. A second question, sort of again, thinking about it as a spectrum, but within social media platforms, what about the hosting function? Just the decision whether to allow something on your platform or not.
Right.
There, I'm not sure that they should be required to host things, but I do think that that they don't have a First Amendment right to say we refuse to carry it just because we don't like it. There's a trio of Supreme Court cases, which I'd be happy to get into later, that pretty strongly suggest that requiring an entity to essentially host all comers, more or less, host them on a content neutral basis, or at least a viewpoint neutral basis, is generally constitutionally permissible, just like, for example, universities could be required to host military recruiters even if they disapprove of military policy. Then again, it's a spectrum. So in between, we have other questions. So one question is, what about what if a platform says we're going to host you, but we're not going to even tell people your address? So if people do a search on Twitter for you, the name of your organization, we won't tell you that this is their Twitter head. So I think that's pretty close to the hosting function, kind of the location information. But it's an interesting question, how that would play out. Another thing is, what about their conversation management function? So the thing with hosting is, if somebody hosts Twitter hosts the Volok for Volok Conspiracy, it's the name of our blog, feed, and who sees that? People who want to subscribe to Volok, people who go to twitter.com/Volok. So there, I think that's the strongest case, whether strong enough, but at least the strongest case for saying Twitter has to do that on a viewpoint neutral basis. But what about comments? Let's say comments that come up on your Facebook page or comments that come up on your Twitter feed. They often end up being seen by people who didn't sign up for that. They signed up for the page, or they signed up for the Twitter feed. They didn't sign up for the comments. And it's actually a pretty valuable feature that, first of all, at the very least, they block spam. Twitter and Facebook block spam. If Twitter and Facebook didn't block spam comments, if they weren't allowed to do that, they really would become useless. It'll be a net loss for public discourse. But what if they say we're going to block personal insults or vulgarities, or even say racist abuse or some such, so that would be a viewpoint-based blocking? It's an interesting question. On the one hand, it's still third-party speech. It's not Twitter's or Facebook's own speech. So there's some argument for protecting this third-party speech, but at the same time, again, Twitter and Facebook are doing there more than just providing hosting. They're managing an environment. They're managing a conversation. It's kind of like if a university sets up a conference, it can say we're going to invite these people, but not those people. And if somebody asks questions that seem off topic or seem insulting, we're going to cut off their mic in a way that they can't just say we're going to eject. A public university, for example, couldn't say we are going to eject students or expel students because of their ideology. So one thing I think we have to keep in mind is the question is, can they be treated as common carriers, period? Rather, could they be treated as common carriers for each one of these functions? And the answer may be different for some than for others.
It's certainly interesting stuff. Actually, let me pivot into this, because I was about to pull up a tweet in which I got insulted, but set that aside for a moment. Because when you and I were trading emails about this, I had referenced a Supreme Court case that Jerry and I had talked about, which is the Packingham case, which was about access to social media platforms. As we said, by registered sex offenders. It was struck down by the High Court in 2017. Actually, I believe you may have written an amicus brief in that case. Did you?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So we were talking about whether or not, right, if there is a right under the First Amendment to have access to these social media platforms, and the court didn't say that they were, the court didn't explicitly say that they were the new public square, but they made intimations that it was the new public square. Is there not a converse obligation, therefore, because they are the new public square, for them to allow the content to go out for them not to put their thumb on the scale in terms of determining which content can go forward? I guess in a very simple way, what good is a public square if you can't have open debate about all topics within that public square?
Well, the answer is, as a formal First Amendment matter, is that First Amendment law does sharply distinguish government-imposed restrictions from privately imposed restrictions. And again, this is very familiar. Newspapers, everybody has long agreed that newspapers are critical to monitoring the government and to democratic debate and all that. But that doesn't mean the newspapers have to publish everything that everyone submits. They are free from government censorship, but they can impose their own constraints. And again, It's really valuable that they impose their own constraints. One reason we subscribe to a particular newspaper is we think it does a good job of weeding out misinformation and focusing on stuff that is really thoughtful and important, and maybe sometimes even and from a viewpoint that we think is the right viewpoint. So the First Amendment law does sharply distinguish those things. And Packingham simply involved the government forbidding sex offenders, ones who've already served their sentence. So they're not in jail, they're not even on probation. They're back in ordinary life, but it forbade them, North Carolina government forbade them from going on a wide range of social media platforms. The court said that violates their First Amendment rights. And if Facebook decided it didn't want to allow sex offenders, well, good luck to it in trying to figure out who is and who isn't. But that would not violate the First Amendment. It wouldn't be bound by Packingham.
Let me ask you.
But I just want to acknowledge there is a broader point, which isn't, does the First Amendment require social media platforms to allow access to everybody, but rather, do broader First Amendment principles about public discourse, should they lead us to impose similar kinds of rules as a matter of statute, let's say, whether state or federal? That, I think, is an important question. So if the question is, does Packingham secure a First Amendment right of access to social media platforms, even when the platforms say no, the answer is no.
Right.
But if the question is, should the reasoning of Packingham make us think about whether there ought to be some more restraints on social media platforms, that's a very interesting question that I do think we should be considering.
Jerry, go ahead.
Where do you draw the line when it comes to whether something's a government entity or not? In other words, we had an old friend, Fred Smith, who would warn corporations that partner with the government either through direct subsidies or regulatory carve-outs or whatever was being done between the private entity and the government. He would warn that, hey, once you make government your partner, then you open yourself up to all kinds of restrictions and interference. Well, in this case, do these social media platforms, do they receive government benefits that therefore we should consider those benefits when they decide, well, if you're on the wrong side of the masking debate, you can be thrown off social media, you can be thrown off Facebook, even though Facebook succeeds and flourishes because of government carve-outs and government protections and government subsidies.
So the law is quite well settled. Receiving government benefits does not make you a government actor for First Amendment purposes or 14th Amendment purposes or a wide range of other purposes. I'll give you an example. There's a case called Rendell Baker versus Cohn from the early 1980s. It involved a school that I specialized in, I think, children with, I think, emotional problems or something like that. And it got vast amount of government funding. I think the theory was that public schools may not be well set up for dealing with that, but this school is. We're going to subsidize it. I believe over 90% of its budget came from the government.
Wow.
Then the school fired an employee. The employee said, "This is because of my speech." The employee sued under the First Amendment, and the Supreme Court said no First Amendment violation, because even though the school got over 90% of its money from the government, that did not make it a state actor. There are other cases involving regulated monopolies, like a gas company, let's say. It could be the only one allowed in town. It could be heavily regulated by the government. The very fact of its monopoly status is in fact a subsidy, although also there's rate control, so I guess that's,
sure.
That's an extra burden. Doesn't make it into a state actor. Now, what Fred Smith might have been getting at is that there are a lot of statutes that say, as a condition of getting government funds,
right?
Or in exchange for getting government funds, if you get government funds, you're bound in various ways. The classic example is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically says that federally funded entities can't discriminate based on race, among other things. So as a result, if you get federal funds, it's not like the Equal Protection Clause now applies to you. It's that the statute now applies to you. So the fact that platforms may get various government benefits, I'm not sure how much they get. I mean, a lot depends what you count as a benefit. In a sense, they operate on top of the internet, which was created in part with considerable government subsidies.
Sure.
They get various kinds of tax breaks that are often offered to other corporations for, I suppose, creating jobs or whatever else. But that does not make them state actors. But the question that arises is, should that be a basis for the government to regulate them? Although alternatively, you might say we don't even care if they get government benefits. The common carrier laws apply to regardless of whether they get government benefits.
And again, I'm trying to wrap my head around this in a way that our listeners think through this, right? Our listeners aren't experts on the law, aren't constitutional scholars, and so think of Andrew. Think of some questions they might have. Like, for instance, Facebook. So I have certain religious beliefs. One of my it's not me. I'm just saying an example. So my religious belief causes me to question the efficacy and the morality of vaccines, and I express that view on Facebook, Twitter, wherever, and I'm thrown off. Is that a violation of my religious liberty because I'm expressing my religious view?
No.
Well, then
it's not a violation of the free exercise clause. It's not a violation of the religious freedom of registration.
But yet, if I owned a butcher shop, if I was cutting meat and the ladies were coming in with getting their pork chops or whatever else, and I had someone work for me, or express their religious belief, and I fired them over their religious beliefs or their race, I could get in trouble with the government.
Well, because there's a specific statute that bans employment discrimination based on race, and that also mandates that an employer accommodate the religious practices of their employees. It's the type.
And customers as well, right? I couldn't refuse someone to come into my butcher shop or my restaurant because they're Jewish, because they're Black, because they're whatever.
Well, so that becomes a little bit more complicated, and I think the answer may be different for the restaurant and the butcher shop.
Okay.
Title II of the Civil Rights Act does ban discrimination based on race, and I believe also religion, but at least based on race in restaurants and other food service. Let's say restaurants, bars, and other such places.
Sure.
However, it does not ban discrimination in retail, including, I believe, in grocery stores.
Okay.
Now, many states do that.
I get it. The reason I'm asking what seems to be a basic silly question is that I'm just trying. Again, people look at what they think is the unfairness of conservative thought being banned from social media, and they go right to what I just said. Well, it's you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, and you started out in this place. You warned us before we started that this is very complicated. And that's the point I'm trying to get
Jerry,
through.
I think what Professor Volokh is saying in the end is, if we were going to go down the statutory route, if we're going to go down the legislative route, the legislation is going to have to be very carefully crafted, and it's going to have to deal with specific aspects of how these social media platforms do business. Whether or not it is on the recommendation side, or whether it's not on the how they filter out content. This is what we're talking about. That's really what you're getting at, Professor, isn't it?
Well, right. So one thing is I want to stress to people is that a lot of this isn't about what the Constitution.
Yes. Right. Yes, of course.
It's about what statutory extra protections we might think are a good idea. And then, of course, the question is whether maybe those statutory protections are themselves prohibited by the Constitution.
Sure.
So and in statutes, people draw lines. As I said, it's the Title VII applies to employment, but only, I believe, at this point for employers that are 15 or more employees. Title II applies to public accommodations, but only certain kinds of public accommodations. They may not be the best lines that are drawn, but that's what legislatures often do, is they just draw distinctions. We think on balance, this is we should cover certain things one way and certain things another way. So one question that may arise is what lines we think are sensible. So for example, some of these proposed laws say if the platform is large enough, has over 10 million users or something like that, then we should regulate it, and for smaller ones we shouldn't. That's not the Constitution doesn't have a 10 million user clause or draws that distinction, but a statute could draw that kind of distinction in trying to figure out just how much of a burden on public debate, for example, various restraints might be. So yeah, it's complicated in part because there are all of these choices that need to be made, and lines that could be drawn and probably ought to be drawn. Again, I think it's a very important question whether somebody is saying, I am entitled to have my item recommended by the platform, as opposed to simply, I'm entitled to have it be not kicked off by the platform.
Yes, right. And it's a good distinction. And before we let you go, and I know our time is short, we're going to have to get you back because I want to talk to you about the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, the right to self-defense, all of those things. But I just pulled this up, and for those of you who are listening instead of watching, pulled up the front page today of the Volokh conspiracy on Reason.com. That's Reason.com/Volokh, Volokh. And you've got this piece up here that I want you to talk about before we let you go. The right to defy criminal demands, the duties to retreat, and to comply with negative demands. You just have this up today. Tell us a little bit about that, because I know it's something both Jerry and I are interested in.
Well, it's hard to tell a little bit about it. So many things. It's part of
which is why we have to have you back.
Yes.
So let me just tell you about the big picture of the article.
Sure.
I'm serializing a draft article of mine. And so the question is, let's say some criminal comes up to you and says, I'm going to bomb your building if you don't close your abortion clinic. And you say, no, I refuse to be pushed around by you. Then he bombs your building. Well, it's bad for you, obviously, but you ran the risk as a courageous person. But then somebody who's injured in the bombing sues not him, he doesn't have any money, or he couldn't be found. He sues you for negligently allowing or negligently causing in provoking this criminal and then not giving into his demands, negligently causing this bombing. Or they may sue you for nuisance even before the bombing. Your neighbor sued. There was a case recently in Georgia where, in fact, the neighbors of an abortion clinic got a $1.5 million verdict against the clinic because they said, oh, Drew, once somebody firebombed it, we're afraid it's going to happen again. It diminishes our property values, diminishes our enjoyment and use of our property. And ultimately, in part, we hope because of an amicus brief that we filed on behalf of a bunch of groups, including gun rights groups, including free speech groups, who said, look, this could happen to a gun store, this could happen to a church, this could happen to a bookstore. The Georgia Court of Appeals reversed, essentially saying you don't have to give in to criminals. So one way in which this arises in some measure is in this well-known duty to retreat in criminal law, and the much less well-known duty to comply with negative demands. Basically, if somebody comes up to me in a state that has the duty to retreat, which now is only about a quarter of the states, not including my own California, for example, but some states do have that. So somebody comes up to me and says, leave this bar or I'll kill you.
Yes.
Stay here. And I happen to have a gun. So I feel if he's going to attack me, I've got a good chance of defending myself. So he attacks me. I defend myself using deadly force. Then under the duty to retreat in those states, I can't claim self-defense anymore.
Yeah.
Because I could have avoided the need for self-defense by retreating from this place. And then about half of those 13 states, I oversimplified here, but basically that, also follow a broader rule, which is that if you could avoid the need for deadly self-defense by complying with the demand that you refrain from an action, generally not the demand that you actually do something, but you refrain from an action, then in that case, again, you forfeit the right to self-defense if you fail to comply. So in principle, there are only two cases I've found in which this was ever actually litigated, because I think a lot of prosecutors realize this can't be quite right, even though it is the statute in those states. In principle, if somebody says, says to a gay couple, stop kissing each other in front of me, or I'll kill you. And they say, no, we're not going to go along with that. And fortunately, they're armed. And he tries to kill them. and then they kill him, or they don't even kill him, but
Sure.
they use deadly force in a way that doesn't lead to death, they could be prosecuted for murder or for attempted murder on the theory that forfeited the right to self-defense. Or if somebody says, I never want to see you with my ex-girlfriend because I'm still jealous, and I say, no, I'm entitled to go where I want with whomever I want. I won't let you push me around this way. And then I show up somewhere with my ex-girlfriend. The guy happens to be there. He tries to attack me. I use deadly self-defense. Again, in the states that follow this duty to comply, which is only 7 states.
Yes.
In principle, I could be guilty of murder if I kill him in self-defense, because I could have avoided this just by, well, not just by, but by giving in to his demands. So the point of my article is, as a general matter, that's not the way the law should operate.
Sure.
You could easily get into the realm of the ridiculous, right? So say I live in one of these 7 states, and I'm happily married, and a stranger comes to me and says that your wife is very beautiful. I want to marry your wife. You must divorce your wife. If you don't divorce your wife, I'm going to kill you and your wife. And then I refuse to divorce.
That's why I said duty to comply with negative demand.
Okay.
I will kill you unless you do something. Like
Right.
somebody says, look, I'll kill you unless you beg for your life. And you say, no. And then the guy whips out a knife, you whip out a gun, and you kill him. Seems to me perfectly legit. And the states would say that because
Okay.
it's asking you to comply with a positive demand. North Dakota, interestingly, is the only one that allows for a limited.
Wow.
Why North Dakota? Who knew?
Oh my goodness.
But as to negative demand, so it would be like, I don't want you to see you in public with your wife because I used to date her, and I'm so upset that I lost her, and I'm jealous of you. Then you'd have to avoid being seen in public with your wife.
But that's insane.
Yes.
I agree.
So, Professor Volokh, the pieces, it's being serialized in the Volokh conspiracy. We're going to put the link up there. I know you have to go, but Eugene Volokh, the Gary T. Schwartz Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA Law School, we got to get you back, sir.
Yes.
Be a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Take care.
Talk later. Thanks, guys.
And with that, we're going to move to the bottom line.
The bottom line.
Welcome to the bottom line segment. Jerry was chomping at the bit. Go right ahead, Jerry.
Well, again, it shows a couple of things, right? It shows a couple of 3 things. This conversation. Number one, how complicated the law is, how complicated the legislation is, and therefore the fact that we have so many laws, the proliferation. Thank you. Of laws, the overcriminalization. We talked about this the other day over the phone. No one can answer the question how many laws there are in the federal code. No one knows. In fact, the Heritage Foundation is starting a special project.
Well, they've been doing the overcriminalization project for a while,
right? But however, a specific header in that project is to actually count how many federal laws there are. Now, but again, it goes to show also how dangerous Congress is, the modern day Congress, and how we need to return to regular order, because and when it comes to free speech, when it comes to accommodation, when it comes to social media, censorship, there needs to be law that is very carefully crafted, right? And the fact of the matter is, Congress no longer does this. Congress will write broad pieces of legislation and then allow regulators and courts to interpret what the legislation is.
So I pulled up, for those of you who are not watching or listening. Yes, I've pulled up on Amazon. You and I have talked about this book before. It's worth reading. It's called 3 Felonies a Day: How the Feds Target the Innocent. It says Kindle edition by Henry Silverglate. It essentially gets down to this issue of overcriminalization. Something we ought to get somebody from that project on with us to talk about these things.
He also said something that I want to just reiterate, because it's something that you and I have talked about before. You and I know I've talked about either on your show, my show, on a podcast together. We've talked about how, and I actually wrote a piece on this once. I think I got to go back and check how the railroad as a common carrier really is the example of how we should be governing social media platforms. And what Eugene did for us here is he made it very clear. He said that that might very well be, but that's not what the law says now.
Yes.
And that's very interesting to me. I also think it's very interesting how he's talked about how the three different functions of social media, whereas two of the three functions could be reinterpreted and put into the law that they're common carrier and therefore have certain restrictions in terms of restricting free speech and that sort of thing. But the point is, our Congress isn't anywhere near this kind of modernity in terms of bringing 19th century and 20th century law into the 21st century.
It reminds me of the debate and discussion over cryptocurrency and we're going to do it. We're going to do a whole episode, on crypto.
Does crypto still exist? I heard it crashed. It's all gone, baby.
Oh, listen, remember, I'm going to say this. Remember, years ago, I invested a few $100s and then a few $100s more. And let's just say this much. I'm not going to get into where it was, but back in there have been two peaks where there's lots and lots of money have been made.
It lost
my crypto holdings are, at least when I looked the other day, were half. The value was half of what it was back in April.
Yeah.
And so it's or maybe it was the fall. I don't know. Anyway, I got to go back. The point is, crypto's lost about half its worth, and some of it has to do with the rumblings that the Biden administration is making about crypto policy. But the point is that there are four ways to look at it. And I'm not going to get into the four ways. There are three existing ways of looking at cryptocurrency. That could be, I am going to say it could be a security, it could be a commodity, it could be a currency. There are three sort of statutory sections that deal with those things. Or it could be a fourth thing, which is an entirely new kind of an investment entity, which is probably what it needs to be.
I have no idea what crypto is.
It's okay, and I'm not going to get into that'll be the question.
It's
funny, real quick, because I want to talk about this, and I wanted to sort of talking about these issues of rights and about positive and sort of negative demands that are made, sort of the tail end of the conversation. And I know you at some point want to do a whole show talking about shows like Quantum Leap, et cetera. Did you ever watch Billions?
I haven't yet.
Okay.
You told me to watch it when it was the first couple seasons.
The first two seasons are great.
Yeah.
The first two seasons are the modern version of Atlas Shrugged. That's really what it is.
Because the current season with this new guy,
well, yes,
seems to be just big government propaganda.
Well, there's that, but it's so. Paul Giamatti plays the Attorney General of the United States,
and he's a hero now. Is he a hero now?
Of the state. Well, right. So
he's standing on cars and demanding justice.
Okay, but I'm going to tell you this fact set, and this is why I think that the show has lost me, because there's so much missed on. I actually would have liked to have talked to Professor Volek about some of this stuff because there are legal issues that are involved. So the Attorney General, Paul Giamatti's character, has bought a farm in the Hudson Valley. And his adjacent neighbor, by the way, there are going to be spoilers here. The adjacent neighbor has 6 old, ancient Revolutionary War era cannon that he fires twice a day, morning and night. And Paul Giamatti doesn't like this.
Why? Because of the noise? Because
of the noise, and apparently
because cannons are
he bought
weapons of war, and
he bought this property. Well, no, when he gets to that, and so. The Attorney General of New York, after he goes and tries to get his neighbor to try to shut this down, not only does he then go, and remember, he's just bought this farm in the Hudson Valley, he then goes and enlists the entire town to try to petition this guy to stop. This guy is a good member of the community. He buys equipment for the local fire department. He's donated other things to the community. So he's really being a good neighbor. All Paul Giamatti brings is his rabble rousing skills. Paul Giamatti brings out a naturalist to the property because he's upstream from the guy, and the naturalist doesn't find any evidence of anything endangered, right? And you see him pull out the textbook. He goes out with the naturalist, trespasses on this guy's property, kicks off. There is no endangered species, But then, Jerry, suddenly, after he promises a nice donation to the professor, the Attorney General of New York, magically the cannon owner's property is now found to be habitat for an endangered bog turtle. And they're now not only demanding that, or the government is now insisting that he no longer fire the cannon, they are confiscating the cannon. And I sat there and I watched this, and I got really angry about this. There's so much wrong with this story, in which, you're right, Paul Giamatti is being painted as the hero, but all he is an authoritarian interloper who bought a piece of property without his due diligence, without knowing that his neighbor fires off a cannon. And rather than just lump it and sell the property and get the hell out of the community, he brings the full weight of the government of the state of New York to seize this guy's property, to trespass and seize this guy's property. And
and the show depicts the Giamatti character as good. Like, this is a good thing that he's doing.
Yes.
The way you just explained it, it seems that he's a bully and a jerk.
Yes. Well, at least that's my perception of this. But the show is painting him to be the good guy, because Michael McKean is just a rich old white guy who is showing his privilege by firing off his cannon twice a day. And he's a big Second Amendment nut. And there's this and there's that.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
Well,
so
look,
anyway, yeah. Go ahead. I brought the show to a stop. My point is this.
What is your point?
My point is that we have these laws that are written in such a way that these agents of government can abuse them. Sure. And we're now at a point in which popular media, we're now at a point in which popular media is portraying these agents of the state, these authoritarian agents of the state, as heroes for doing this.
This is not a sudden thing. Hollywood for years has deemed the government attorney going after chemical companies and pharmaceutical. When was the last movie when the chemical company is the hero, or the pharmaceutical company saves the day? The defense contractor is a good guy. It doesn't exist. It never happened. Hollywood has been anti-corporate, and again, and I don't, nowadays I don't care so much, because corporations have been swallowed up by the left. I complained to you earlier today that yes. I'm watching Roku, and Roku, there's a Walmart commercial, and then there's another commercial for a gaming system that has alternative lifestyle families. And again, in adult conversation, adult company, people could live their lives the way they want to. But I'm teaching my children certain values, and I can't even put my kid in front of a cartoon, a show for a child, without big corporation trying to brainwash my child into believing something that is contrary to the values I'm teaching my child. It's everywhere.
I mean, it gets to the level of ridiculousness. So right now there is the Disney discussion, for instance, of this remake of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
I know, so ridiculous.
But this is, we would have said, years ago that this is ridiculousness. This would have been considered parody.
What is the actor? What is the actor's name who's complaining?
Peter Dinklage.
All right, who happens to be a dwarf.
Yes, a little.
And now he's complaining that there might be dwarfs in the remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Well, I mean, and it's we can sort of pull this up.
Do dwarfs not exist?
Yes, but
they shouldn't be depicted in media in any manner. I don't understand his complaint.
Hold on.
His complaint is that the dwarfs are going to be dwarfs, which to me is it's just
what he's saying is that it's a backwards story, right? Which is he writes, literally, no offense to anyone, but I was a little taken aback. They were very proud to cast a Latina actress as Snow White, but you're still telling the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Take a step back and look at what you're doing here. It makes no sense to me. And then I want to talk about
but in no way are the dwarf characters depicted as they're not objectified. They're not dehumanized.
Well,
There's seven individuals who support and love the Snow White character.
Well, let's remember that they are all some kind of an archetype, right? Dopey, grumpy, bashful doc.
Yeah, and that's called storytelling, and I mean, and all major stories.
But
and
remember, the bottom line here is that they are all hardworking and helpful. All they want to do is save and protect Snow White. And that's a truly noble thing. And it's a story in the end about the nobility of
these men,
yes.
whether they're dwarfs or not.
That's exactly it.
And again, because I don't understand what he's complaining about. He's complaining about that the fairy tale itself is something that should just go by the wayside.
Listen, I'm pulling this. I'm gonna hold on.
There's a remake of Snow White where she is a warrior princess, and the dwarfs are warriors that come and sacrifice their lives. I mean, is he saying that we should no longer tell this story because there's dwarfs in it?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Apparently, that's exactly what he's saying. Listen,
he's an idiot then,
Jerry. I'm going to offer up the immortal. Hold on. I'm going to offer up the immortal words of Jedediah Springfield: "A noble spirit embiggens the smallest man." Which is truly the essence of the Snow White story.
It'd be one thing if it was a story that somehow objectified and delegitimized and dehumanized dwarfs. That's not what this story does. It's just it's a stupid complaint, and someone should have had the balls to tell him you're an idiot.
Cojones, Gary. Remember, it's we're family friendly show.
But let's go back again. I want to bottom line what
Professor Volokh said.
What he said, and that is, even where there aren't constitutional protections and or restrictions, it's the spirit of free speech, that should govern. And I can say, there are not many conclusions from this show. We haven't solved anything in terms of the social media problems with censorship. But I tell you how we can save free speech, right? And the show is the Andrew and Jerry Save Free Speech. Yeah. And that's this way. And that is the spirit of free speech, the idea of it, the principle of free speech should be governing what's happening at Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the rest.
But it's funny because you started off the show by saying, well, we really, we haven't saved anything yet. The reality is that the saving of the world is an ongoing process, right? Listen, if there's anything the MCU has taught us over the last 15 years, Jerry, is that you have to step up there and save the world.
Andrew, where I'm not sure if the world can be saved. Well, at that point. But I think we're in the end of it. I have a question for you. I have a legit question.
No. Before you get to the question. Okay.
I got to ask you.
Go ahead.
So Eric and I had a long conversation earlier today, right? There was this instance in school where the school teachers were recruiting a girl, I think it was a girl, to become transgendered.
Yes.
And they changed her name, and they had all kinds of counseling, and they gave her books. They literally were recruiting her, and they warned her, don't tell your parents and all the rest of it. And I said to her, this is why Christians, people of faith, should not be sending their kids to public school, because this isn't just that school. This is in schools everywhere. Public schools want to indoctrinate, period. And so therefore, people of faith, if they're indoctrinating your child to a certain faith that's contrary to your faith, you have an obligation to pull your kids out.
Listen, I agree with that.
But here's the question to you.
Yeah.
Should people of faith begin to just simply withdraw? And we should have our own communities of social media, of schools, of commerce, etc.
This gets into first of all, right? I mean, part of it gets into the Great Commission, Jerry, right? Which is, we are called upon to
never say the Great Commission is not to save the culture; it's to save individuals. Christians in particular can withdraw from society, from the culture, and develop its own culture separate from, like the Amish.
I'm not listening. But I'm not. But right. I mean, but you look at the Amish, and you look at the various Hasidic communities, both in New York City and then upstate.
Yeah.
Not that I consider Rockland County to be upstate, but up in Rockland
anything
County,
above the Bronx is upstate.
Yes, my friend. I understand. No, Westchester County is not.
Yonkers is upstate to me. I'm serious.
No, it isn't. Anyway,
Yeah. When I was a kid,
I
we went
understand.
to my cousin's house in Yonkers. My father would say, "We're going upstate."
It's funny you say that because when we lived in Westchester, when would go across
Westchester's
the
upstate, my friend.
Rockland County is not upstate. I don't even think when I would go to Boy Scout camp up in Dutchess County, I didn't consider Dutchess County.
Westchester County is absolutely upstate.
I consider upstate anything north of Dutchess County.
Anything north of Van Cortlandt Park is
yes. And I'll pull up the map in a second to show you. No, Jerry, listen, I'm not a fan of. I'm
not saying we should do it. It's a question I raised.
I'm not a fan, but listen, this gets into my point about the conversation with Eugene Volokh, which is, listen, what it did help is it certainly helped me. I don't know if it helped you further crystallize your views on this, right? If we're gonna work to save the world, right? And I know that's a big lofty rhetorical device. But my point is, if we're going to, for instance, work on the issue, if I'm going to speak out on this issue, and I want to, because I think something
we
needs
have
to
to
be
know
said,
the facts. We have
having
to know
a better understanding of the law and going to someone whose legal scholarship I respect. And I do, I don't talk, I more normally when I talk about legal scholarship, I spend a lot of time, talking about Jonathan Turley, but I read the Volokh conspiracy because I appreciate, I don't always agree with, but I would say 3 times out of 4 times out of 5, I will agree with what the author of something at the Volokh conspiracy. Listen, I will say our good friend, I meant to mention this to Professor Volokh, our old friend and colleague Jonathan Adler is one of the writers at the Volokh conspiracy.
So is
I know
so Steve Hayward,
Ilya Shapiro. I mean, all these guys.
Yeah.
So
let me throw this at you though, because I get what you're saying. What he's presenting is this is what you have to consider and know, and how, if you want to make these reforms, how to do it. He's playing by the rules, the rules of law, the rules of the Constitution, the rules of scholarship. The problem is the left doesn't play by the rules. And I give you an example. I wanted to ask him this, but we didn't get a chance to. In the recent Supreme Court decision on the vaccine mandate, right? The court came 6-3 saying that the private sector mandate was unconstitutional. Ironically, part of that was because it was an emergency order, and OSHA can't make emergency orders. What's OSHA doing right now? It's withdrawn the mandate, and they're rewriting it not as an emergency order.
No,
so we're going to go back to the court again soon. But and again, I said this on the show when we were talking about the Supreme Court. I said that to me, the more problematic part of this case was the CMS mandate.
Absolutely.
And the court 5-4 ruled, right. The opinion was that the 10 million healthcare workers can be forced into a vaccine mandate because Medicaid funding and the government's regulatory administrative control over Medicaid, and how the court, 5 Supreme Court justices literally ignored the law to rule that the mandate was constitutional. So my point is that the left continues to win because it ignores the law. It's untethered from the law. And we have conversations like this where we're talking about the different degrees of this, and is it a common carrier, or should it be a Jerry? The question is, remember how he rightfully corrected me when he said is or should be. See, we have, and this goes to your dad, your dad's constructive criticism of our conversations, and that is sometimes we're just so preoccupied with getting it right, we're just losing all the battles.
Well, no, and I understand that. I mean, yes, this is listen, and it gets to everything that we have been talking about on this show, whether or not it has to do directly with the speech issues or these other issues that are involved. It very much is as these issues get chipped away at over time, as the other side is looking at a long ball game.
Yep.
Right. They're looking
and
down
winning
the road at this. So we seem to be losing these things. Now, I go back and forth because there are battles that we have won. And interestingly enough, on this one, and we didn't get into the whole net neutrality side of things, this issue of net neutrality is one that has gone back and forth over the years. And eventually, if the left succeeds at chipping away at the courts, if they succeed in packing the courts, that's a battle that we're going to lose, right? We won the filibuster fight last week, but that doesn't mean, that this isn't their goal down the road, that we're going to,
Sure.
we're not going to win it down the road. Jerry, but listen, because I want to shift gears a little bit, because we didn't talk about this at the opening of the show. As we're talking about these issues, as we're talking about the speech issues and the back and forth, because it does get into the issue of deplatforming, this insane, and I got to say, this insane call by Neil Young, right, to demand that Spotify remove the Joe Rogan show.
The rock and roller who for 30, 40 years, 50 years has been talking about government power and to resist the government and resist the establishment, is now saying to comply with the government, comply with the establishment, conform, and if you don't conform, you take my music off.
Yeah, here I'm gonna share a series of tweets that I put up yesterday. First there was this one. Neil Young, more like Neil Young.
Very good. Very smart. Very smart.
And then I rewrote the lyrics to Ohio. Oh no, that's not the Ohio one. That's the other one. Oh, good Lord. And I lose it. There we go. To Ohio. Tin soldiers and Biden's coming. You better put on that mask. Don't question the latest science. Just shut up and get your vax. Got to get used to it. Science is religion now. Don't question faith anymore. What if you knew truth and tried to say it out loud? How can you speak when you're gagged?
Yeah, it's again the
Neil
Young.
I wrote that.
All my buddies who are a little older than me. Erica's brother-in-law is in his 60s. My buddy Jim is whose birthday was yesterday. He just turned 67. All my buddies who are former hippies, and part of the reason why a guy like my buddy Jim liked rock and roll so much was because it was anti-establishment. It was pushing back on conformity. And here you have Neil Young, right? One of the greatest protest artists in rock and roll history, is now trying to get Joe Rogan removed from Spotify because Joe Rogan isn't promoting the government line on an issue. Remember too, Joe Rogan doesn't do show after show after show on vaccines and on COVID. Yeah. I mean, I just listened to his show yesterday. He has Jim Gaffigan. Yeah,
sure.
What's his name? The comedian on it, however you say his name. And they don't talk about COVID. They talk about George Carlin, stand up. They talk about comedy. And again, so Rogan does tens of thousands of hours of shows.
Yes.
Neil Young doesn't like one of the shows, and so now he wants Rogan off.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because you talked about this, the anti-establishmentarian side of this. Here's where I come down, right? I don't get truly vexed. I found it funny, and so I wrote my little parody.
I get vexed. I get vexed over it because Rolling Stone wrote the article.
It's like the same. Sorry, go ahead.
But Rolling Stone wrote the article talking about it, right? Rolling Stone, again, there's a whole history of Rolling Stone getting things wrong, right?
Yes.
But also Rolling Stone, a great anti-establishment publication, and more recently has become so woke and so political. It's not the same magazine it once was. However, this is what Rolling Stone gets wrong. Neil Young doesn't even own 50% of his own catalog.
Yes.
So he has no right. He has no right to call for it to be taken down from Spotify. You'd think Rolling Stone, when they were writing about the issue, would have known that.
And it's not like it's ancient news. It's literally, we're just coming up on the 1 year anniversary of him doing that. But my point is this: it's the same reason why, because I'm a member of a bunch of classic rock pages, and because I like talking about these things and having discussions. So, there's a fan page dedicated to WNEW, which was a big classic rock station in New York. And the guy who's the admin of that page, he's just a real
102.6,
1027.
1027.
1027.
1027.
Yeah. So
when we used to go to Westchester upstate, I would listen to it in the car.
There you go. Yes. Now essentially it's been replaced by Q1043 in New York. But the point is that there are people on that page and there are elsewhere who are apoplectic. They've gone themselves insane over Eric Clapton's doubling down on what Eric Clapton has said about vaccinations. And it's a whole thing. And it's
he's a demigod now, not God any longer.
Yes. Or Van Morrison, same thing. Yeah. Though Van Morrison hasn't been nearly as vocal as Clapton has. And it's like, again, I don't go to guys like Neil Young for my virtue signaling, how to be signaled at in terms of these things. So it's crazy.
But again, all these woke members of these rock and roll. This is anti rock and roll.
Yes.
Right. This is not rock and roll. And also, I'll say this, and you probably disagree with me. I think Neil Young stinks anyway. I think his voice is screechy.
I've always loved Neil Young.
I've never liked him.
I will say this.
Now I have reason to dislike him.
I will say this. I've been a fan of Neil Young.
Southern man, like he can't even sing.
Yeah, but that's never. But he plays a mean guitar and he writes. He's a great lyricist. I will say this much, and this is true. After 9/11, it's actually tying it all together. After 9/11, I was listening to Pete Fornatel, who used to be on WW, now on Fordham or at least at the time was on Fordham University Radio, WFUV. And he played Neil Young's Don't Let It Bring You Down, which is, and that song made me feel better about the world. Don't let it bring you down. It's only castles burning. It goes on from there. So, but listen, again, I know Neil Young, not everybody's taste. I happen to like Neil Young's music, but I'm able to separate, more to the point, I'm able to separate Neil Young's music from who he is, but also
we have to. You can't like rock and roll. Like guys like us, we wouldn't even listen to rock and roll music if we allowed the politics to color what we like and dislike.
To an extent, right? I mean, right? If it's the music of rebellion, if it's the music of angst, you can still be drawn to those kinds of things. But I think it's hard for someone to say that they are a political rebel in their 70s,
right,
when they sell their music catalog for $150
million, right?
And this person is going to sit here and lecture to me about my life and how I ought to live my life.
Here again, I'm the bottom line guy. The bottom line on Neil Young is that the Rolling Stones should have done their homework and understood that his catalog had been sold, that he had no right to call for his music to be pulled off. Number one. Number two, someone should have pointed out that the rock and roller, the anti-establishment rock and roller who questioned the government and the government line is now wants to harm those entertainers and celebrities and artists for being contrarian. And then lastly, Neil Young's music is a big old stinko, and I tell you why. Because the definition of good rock and roll is from the Fonz, and the Fonz said that rock and roll music, good rock and roll music, should want to make you go to the parking lot and beat somebody up. Neil Young, his music makes you want to slit your wrists.
That's not true. I disagree wholeheartedly.
You disagree with the Fonz?
I disagree with I don't disagree with the Fonz definition. I disagree with your perception of Neil Young's music. I'm sorry. You go back and you listen.
Neil Young music makes you want to beat up Neil Young.
A lot of what Neil Young wrote for Buffalo Springfield is pure rock music, and his songs that he wrote for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Good,
another musical act that I have no use for.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yes, and I know you and I disagree vehemently over that. Listen, before we go, guys, Jerry, because we really are running out of time here.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
Before we go, A couple of things. Housekeeping. We can still say that word. While we can still say that word. So we need you to, if you listen to the show, we need you to subscribe, whatever platform you listen to. We need you to recommend it to your friends, and we need you to write reviews. That's how we get noticed. We know you're all out there, and depending on whatever platforms you're listening on, though, once again, if you listen on your Amazon Alexa, because otherwise she'll hear me. I don't think you can subscribe there, but please let folks know that you can watch there. Now, next week, Jerry and I are going to do a show, I think, live in studio together.
Excellent.
It will be, whether it's the main show or a bonus show, we are going to do something that's interactive, where we'll pick a topic, whether it's music or TV or movies or something on that order, and we're going to want you to participate in it. So,
yes.
So we'll figure out a way to do that. So tune in. Jerry, please let us know what people ought to be doing with their lives in terms of our sign off.
Well, it's easy, right? Find the truth, plant your feet there, and stand firm.
And have a great week, everybody. And please stay safe.